Hi, Chris.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are.
It's 4 o'clock.
Yeah, 4 o'clock. There you go.
Well done.
What time is it there, Chris? It's like 11?
Yeah, I'm still on coffee.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm doing the mid-afternoon LaCroix thing myself. So, and you guys are into the evening over there in the UK. I'm so glad you could join us, Chris. It's great to see you.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
It's great to see you all as well. And I really do. I mean, I'm so grateful for the invitation and the opportunity.
You're
such a fun conversation to be a part of, sort of fly on the wall when the three of you were chatting before. I'm excited to see where this goes.
Well, good. We're so thrilled that you reached out and had any interest and passion. And I offered to kind of get the ball rolling today. And I wanted to start by saying, like, hi, welcome, Chris, but tell us about who you are and your work as a veterinary behaviorist in Portland and kind of a little snapshot of your journey in business.
Yeah, so yeah, my name is Chris Pachel, and I am a board certified vet behaviorist through the American College, the American College of Veterinary Behaviorists, and I achieved board certification in 2010. So I've been doing sort of this chapter of this journey, whatever we're going to call this, for about, going on 11 years now, 10 and a half years. I've been a veterinarian since 2002. And really have been specifically focusing on the behavioral space since 2004 in some capacity, so about 17 years or so. And, here at the Animal Behavior Clinic, it's myself. I have one other board certified veterinary behaviorist in the practice as well. I have one resident and then one other general practitioner who's just an amazing clinician in terms of what she does with her clients and for our patients. So there's 4 of us seeing cases in the practice. In a very, very small consultation space that we're making the most of, expanding into all of the virtual stuff that we're able to do now and so on. But I guess the backstory for me that's relevant here is, I started out aiming for a veterinary degree for, quite honestly, as long as I can remember. That was always the destination. I loved animals, and that was the destination point. And once I got into the practice of vet med, I kind of realized that I loved people too, which was not necessarily the realization that all veterinarians make, but
it's the only way you stay in the game.
Right? You sort of block it out or you embrace it head on. And that was actually how I got into behavior, is that I went into vet med for animals, and then I fell in love with my clients and was hearing their pain points and thought, well, gosh, what can we do here? And I started to dabble a little bit and get some additional continuing education in the behavioral space. And man, once I started to get just a couple of layers peeled back, I was like, okay, wait a minute, this is my jam. And I remember coming back from an intensive CE thinking, this is the beginning of the end of my general practice career. Mm-hmm. I don't know what it's going to look like next, but I'm headed there. And so then that kicked me back into residency and then onward to board certification and so on. But I think the piece that has stuck with me through all of that is really trying to say, how do we meet both our animal learners and our clients where they are? What does it look like to walk them through that and to try to understand as best we can what their struggles are? Not that I'm ever going to know exactly what it's like to sort of walk a day in their shoes, but by the same token, if I can sort of meet them where they are, then we can start to feel what solutions are available and relevant. And well, gosh, let's just take those steps together and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And so that's been something we've really tried to embody through the practice and with the residents that I have the fortunate opportunity to work with and to mentor, really trying to embrace that aspect, not only memorizing our drugs and our psychopharmacology and our physiologic mechanisms, but also saying, and what's the heart and real life aspect of what this looks like, and how do we, even before we've memorized all that psychopharmacology, how do we do this job really well? Because we can look up the rest of the stuff in the book. Let's really meet people where they are and see where that takes us. So that's me in a nutshell.
Well, that's awesome. And I think it ties right into why we wanted you to do episode 2, because we wanted to go peel back the next layer of the onion about the rubber meeting the road and what this looks like in practice. And you have developed quite the reputation for yourself in the industry for being wonderful with people as well as the dogs, and being very practical and looking at a situation instead of the ivory tower, impossible kind of behavior plan. What does this look like? What can we do? What can't we do? And that compassion that gets to the heart of the experience of all the parties, which is exactly the heart of these conversations and what's inspired us to be talking about this model going beyond the operant into other places. And we were thinking it might be perfect to talk about this kind of tendency that we've had in the behavior industry, also in the human behavior industry, frankly, to kind of pathologize behavior rather than really unpack it and look at it and understand the what and the why beneath the symptoms of the behavior that we might be seeing, instead of the behavior symptoms being kind of the end all be all that we're just manipulating. So we're so glad you're here.
I love that. I'm like, okay, now my brain goes in 37 different directions with that one question. So like, how much time do we have?
Right, yeah, as much as we want, as long as anyone will listen. So jump off, jump in.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind there. I think one, as human learners and as clinicians even, we want clarity. So it's so much easier to create sort of an us, them, or this, that dichotomy. Oh, it's normal or abnormal. The moment we start looking at any of these patterns along a continuum, well, then it gets muddy. And then you have to say, well, what are my criteria? What are my parameters? What are my diagnostic little nuggets that I'm utilizing? And much of what we do doesn't really lend itself to that. Like I can't run a blood test and be like, oh, yep, that's pathology. Like I can if we're talking about, a dog with Cushing's disease. Mm-hmm. I can't do that if I'm trying to draw the line. The classic example that comes up when I'm teaching some of the students at the vet schools that I teach at is when we talk about compulsive disorder as an example. Well, there's this sort of like continuum from it's a normal expression of behavior. Oh, it might be a little bit, I'm going to use a label here, frustration induced, mm-hmm. or we might be talking about it in terms of a displacement behavior. Well, now it's actually getting a little bit more stereotypic. Well, now it's actually interfering with sort of normal eating, sleeping, resting mm-hmm. patterns. So now we're going to call it compulsive disorder. But if you're just looking at a 30-second clip of that behavior, whatever it is, the behavior itself doesn't often look like pathology. Mm-hmm. It could be attention seeking, it could be reinforced, it could be filling a need, it could also be indicative of some underlying physiologic, psychopharmacological something. But how do you really make that determination? And so I think about that in that particular example, and again, coming back to the role as the clinician, to be able to have that answer for the client who's saying, help my dog. It's so much easier to basically say, well, if your dog was normal, it would do this. And so we're going to put everything else in this abnormal category, rather than talking about it potentially as an adaptive or maladaptive response to some sort of environmental or social stressor. And gosh, what would it look like to, I don't know, look at the stressor and say, can we manipulate the animal's relationship or exposure to that stressor instead? And then at the very least say, then what? If we change that relationship, if we change the exposure and the behavior resolves, diminishes, whatever the case is, well, cool. Now that informs us as to the level of pathology or normalness that might be there for that particular behavior. But, just looking at that 30-second clip, there's no way of knowing where in the continuum you actually are. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really uncomfortable place for veterinarians, veterinary behaviorists, trainers, behavior consultants, whatever our sort of specialty is. I think it's an uncomfortable place to be. And so we avoid it, right? Why would we seek that out?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because at vet school, they never taught us the difference between mental health diagnoses and physiological diagnoses. So they never taught us that, for everything else, you're making a diagnosis based on fact. And you may not have a lot of facts to base your diagnosis on, but you have some evidence on which to hang it. Whereas when you're looking at mental health diagnoses, whether it's human or animal, you might be assuming that there's pathology there, but there may be absolutely no pathology there whatsoever. And there are endless examples in the human literature of people who've been diagnosed with what we thought were truly pathological conditions like schizophrenia, where there's something structurally, not just functionally wrong with your brain, who spontaneously recover when they go through therapy. So it's difficult then to understand what the similarities and differences may well be between their experience of what they were diagnosed with versus the experience of somebody who doesn't spontaneously recover. And I think we haven't even started having that conversation in vet med yet. I mean, I don't know, I don't move in the circles that you do, so maybe it's different in specialist circles, but I still feel, certainly amongst the general practitioners that I speak to, that there isn't really that appreciation that we're making a diagnosis based on symptoms, not on histopathology, blood tests, physiology, you know, not on objective measures, but very much subjective measures.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I think that actually, to my mind, also brings in the concept of making a prognosis, right? So we're so tied to what is the diagnosis, what's the prognosis. And one of the evolutions in my career has really been to, I wouldn't say eliminate the prognosis conversation, but I have almost eliminated the prognosis conversation. When clients are like, well, what's the likelihood this is going to get better? I mean, the honest answer is I have no idea. Right. And I've gotten a lot more comfortable saying I don't know over the years. But you know, coming back to what you were saying there, Kathy, it's sort of like we can sort of use whatever subjective criteria or observations or patterns that are visible, and we can say, cool, that's our starting point in whatever measurable, observable way it is. Here's what feels like a step forward for whatever we're aiming for. And then we reassess in a week, in a month, in a year. And then I can try to get a sense of how flexible was that learner, or how skilled was the implementer, or how committed were they to that implementation process. But all of those variables influence prognosis. Different from, you know, let's say it's a splenic tumor. Well, we can say, well, these 432 dogs did this when the splenic tumor was removed, and histopathology said this. Behavioral stuff just doesn't work in quite that same way. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it started to feel really inauthentic to try to predict, like I've got some crystal ball, magic wand, you know, clairvoyance about, well, in 3 weeks, we're probably going to be here. I don't know. Like, you could go home and have a family emergency and do nothing for the next 3 weeks. That's a possibility. And so I have to account for that within my conversation that stems in, you know, that comes into that prognosis piece. And so, you know, that I think is another layer that came to mind for me as you were talking there, Kathy. It's just, there's so many layers to this.
Yeah, definitely.
When we think about there's got so many strands from that, just from that. And I think it's really awesome for people listening in, hearing you talk about that, Chris, as well, because we get put under a lot of pressure to come out with fixed outcomes, right? So we're already thinking, what's the fixed outcome? And I think from I don't know so much on the clinical side of things, but this notion of things being curative, you know, if we do this, do that, we can cure that. And I think the same happens with the training world a little bit, especially with if we have quite an operant view, which is if we do that, then we'll get that outcome. In mental health, what I found when in my human psychology days was the more clinical aspects of my profession were still looking on a curative, medicatory, you know, the psychiatrist side of things, whereas the therapist is looking more at client-led outcome. And that's how I see it with this kind of dog-centered care thing I talk about. It's a case of supporting the carers to think about that timeline being very much dictated really by how the dog goes through the process they need to go through. And it's seeing behaviors less as being part of a linear journey, but just being a communication of that change in the emotional experience. So all these kind of things we're talking now are really fundamental, aren't they, to unpacking the things we were talking about last time, Kim, about how we start to see things a little bit differently and losing some of the shackles we have from the way we look at things. I think some of our colleagues who come from either a training background or a clinical background, even in those fields, you still have this kind of looking for outcome. Sarah Fisher has this great thing of NATO, which is no attachment to outcome. which is a great thing. I love that. There's no attachment to outcome. We're just going to do this thing and be very much led by the dog through that process.
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Yeah. And I think right in this field, and both in veterinary behavioral medicine or veterinary medicine in general, or human psychology or dog behavior, you know, one of the things I've always wrestled with, which is part of why I think we all have these moments of imposter syndrome, right, is this expectation that the whole culture has, that I come to you with this problem, you diagnose it and you fix it. So if there's something wrong, it's broken. Your job is to know exactly what it is, wave your little magic wand doing the things that you do, following that little prescription like you're talking about, right? We want these like nice indicators that are observable and measurable. And so, okay, it fits in this box, and then we give it this behavior plan and this medication. And I think we failed a lot of people and dogs, frankly, in both mental health fields, because we treat it like, instead of, oh, what's that expressive of? What is that evidence of? Like we talked about last time with behavior being a barometer, being so curious to say, wow, what's going on? What is that expression, you know? And instead we are so cyclically stuck in this industry, in this idea that we're the puppeteer, and that is our job, it is our responsibility to manipulate the expression of what we're seeing, and not necessarily getting to the heart of it. That may not be people's intentions. As a matter of fact, I would argue most trainers would not characterize their intentions that way, or most veterinary behaviorists, behavior consultants wouldn't. But I think that's what we've accidentally been kind of led into in that exclusively operant model of, hey, that's your job, stay in your lane, you're a trainer, your job is to change behavior, everything else is just conjecture and reach, because you don't actually know. So if a study hasn't been done to demonstrate the dogs have theory of mind, we're just going to assume that they don't, or whatever it might be. Like we talked about last time, flipping the onus so that it's like, well, prove to me that not all these things don't apply to dogs, instead of let's find the one study that proved that they did, and have to repeat and reinvent the wheel for all of those kinds of concepts or principles in biology or nature and behavior in general. So, you know, this is just so important that we're able to start saying it's okay to not know, just like you said, right? Like to get to the point where like, I have no idea. I think this is my operating theory based on this and this and this. Could be this, could be this, could be this. And then we'll see where we are and what happens when we shift this and this, whether or not, again, Andrew, I love your concept of relief. Does that provide the relief? And then all of a sudden the behavior is gone. Because, you know, suddenly when you look at things differently, you see that if you get underneath it to what's causing it in the first place, what's the frustration, what's the rub, what's the friction, what's the, you know, dysfunction in the components of the animal's environment, their genetics, their learning, there's internal health conditions, development, etc., age, sex, all that good stuff. And you can look at it and say, what part is not working? Sometimes you can change a huge environmental condition, say, oh, we'll just stop doing that. And when people come over, do it this way instead for the first 10 minutes. And they're like, oh, weird. The whole thing is just not even a problem anymore. And you didn't actually train the dog. You handed him a bone and put him on the other side of a baby gate for the first 10 minutes and people came in, and all of a sudden we don't have a problem, you know? So I just love that, you know, you have shared that you're kind of moving through a place through your own career too, where you're kind of giving yourself permission to say that you don't know too.
Yes. Well, you know, there's two images that pop to mind for me as we're having this conversation, and these come to me when I'm having conversations with clients too, where especially when we look at some of the more, I'm going to say more complicated cases. Truthfully, I think every case is both simple and complicated depending on which lens you're looking through and then sort of how you're focusing. But in some of the cases where a client may come with 7 different behavioral concerns. And I remember different phases in my life where I'm like, okay, well, this is our focus. So here is your, here is your treatment plan for that. And here's your environmental modification. And here are your training exercises. And so we'd have like these 7 different training plans. And, you know, ultimately what started to sort of happen, or at least I was encountering cases where it started to feel like we were either sort of spinning this wheel of like, what was our focus? What little nugget of life are we focusing on? And sort of what is our spoke of focus, if you will, Or clients would say what almost feels like it's like a game of whack-a-mole, where we get this piece under control, but then that pressure popped out somewhere else. And now we shifted our focus there, and we sort of pushed that down with some sort of operant contingency to just shift the expression of the behavior. And then, oh, it pops out over here now. Oh, now we've got all the behavior stuff under control, but now the dog is breaking with IBD or allergies. And so it came out physically. And so we've got all of these different pieces, and I was like, okay, there's got to be a better system that we could sort of, in that example, almost sort of depressurize the system to say, what if we met the unmet need? What does that look like? Is that as simple as exercise of a certain type? Is that as simple as doing a half an hour decompression sniff walk? Is that, meeting the need of not needing the dog to be present for the first 10 minutes of a social greeting? What is that? But rather than trying to kind of power forward and train our way through and just spinning the wheel or batting down the little pop-up of pressure, we actually start to depressurize. And then what that tells me is, okay, if I've met that need, now what's left?
Yeah.
And then I can be like, oh, cool, you've got a dog who struggles in this context or hasn't learned an appropriate response pattern or has an emotional feeling. Cool, now let's look at a classical conditioning exercises to shift that emotional response, or let's teach your dog an appropriate response pattern that's contingent on that stimulus. But that's almost the next piece versus the starting point. And it works so much better. It just does.
And surely also for your clients, because, your clients want to be heard, they want to be listened to. And I imagine that by the time they've got to the stage where they've been referred to you, they've already, in their eyes, exhausted all other possibilities. So they're probably desperate to be heard or to have that communication with someone who can confidently take them through that process. And that's got to reflect on the dog's mental well-being, whether directly or indirectly. I think I would argue in many cases directly.
Yeah. And it's fun to watch as I'm sure you've all experienced too in various forms of consultation, when you help the client gain clarity and you see that sort of tension release from their shoulders and that moment of like, oh my gosh, this is what felt overwhelming is actually doable. And then like 30 seconds later, you see the dog finally settle in the corner. You're like, I wonder if those two things weren't related, at least a little bit here. And the two of you have been sort of feeding off one another because neither really sort of understood what needed to happen. And we're kind of butting against.
Part of what we were talking about in the last Beyond the Operant, because if your owners are coming to you and your approach is to focus on the behavior and fixing the behavior, then your clients are automatically in that mindset. Very much of A, recognizing that that behavior is wrong or bad, and B, recognizing that it needs fixing, as opposed to you spending the first few consults gathering information from them and learning about their dog and switching them into a mindset where they are inquisitive about, oh, okay, so what is going on with you, rather than just, oh my God, you're really annoying, you're still barking. But, oh, I've noticed now that only happens when the truck goes past, or like becoming more of a detective. I mean, I often talk about feeling like a detective when you're a vet. And I think you're dealing with a behavior case, my own dogs or something, I always feel like a detective as well. But it's a much more constructive and pleasurable state of mind to be in than something's wrong and I need to fix it.
Well, and that fixing mentality, gosh, there's so many pitfalls along the way. I mean, if I'm able to be open and curious and detached from that outcome, well, we'll just see where it takes us, versus I was given a solution by the trainer, by the consultant, by the veterinarian. Now I am responsible for fixing it. If I don't fix it, now I'm also a failure in my implementation, which creates its own set of sort of downstream consequences. And ultimately, we're no closer to fixing the issue that brought the client there in the first place. And yet I think so many of us, have, through our training, I think have been really exposed to a lot more of the, let's say, we'll just call it the quadrant sort of method of application of stuff, right? Of those skills and of the training exercises. And so few have us, in myself included, were actually ever exposed to actual counseling or client consulting skills to say, how do you take that client who walks in with the expectation or the goal or the desire to make my dog stop barking? And how do you actually transform that conversation into something that does allow for curiosity and openness to outcomes? And so many people, that's what I hear over and over again. They're like, I'm flying blind. Like, even if I agree with you, I still don't have a toolbox that allows me to do that. So what do I do next? I have no idea.
Yeah. Certainly that's my experience in vet school particularly, is that we're failing people in consult skills. And interestingly, when I started to go to dog conferences, not that I've been to very many, but I expected that about 50% of the content would be consultation skills, because that is such a huge part of the job. And yet, no, hardly any. It's still all about fixing the dog. It's not about, you know, creating relationships and empowering owners and all of the things that I think make a real difference to the dogs.
But I think sadly, when you're bulk of our education being quite conditioning minded, you know, operant minded, that they come through, because most courses people learn learning theory first, right, before they come on to anything else. I think it doesn't matter so much about connective skills or communication skills, sadly, as long as you can show a piece of training works. That's kind of how you communicate, right? And I think a lot of the feedback I've had from people who've heard us talk, either in this forum or other places, is, God, you know, I really get it, but now I'm really scared because I feel, how am I supposed to get my client to buy into this then? And I had somebody who contacted me about my things I talk about relief, and the person actually said, I'm really scared by this concept as a trainer, that somehow the dog might be seeking relief through these behaviors. I'm really good at getting the dog to do something else, but I'm not so good at thinking about what relief that dog might be seeking. So this is why there's a lot that we have to think about here, because it's not just about talking about this, but also helping our colleagues to learn about the ways through to connect. And for me, my big passion is about exploring the emotional experience both in ourselves and our dogs. And what I find with my clients, by going on that exploration together about the emotional experience, when I say to them now, so how does it make you feel? And then we can wonder how it makes Rover feel. Then we can start to actually speak the same language now, because people can buy into those concepts a lot more. And it's a case of front loading these things, but we do have to think about how we support and educate our colleagues to think about how they do those communicating things. And the way you talk, Chris, it just sounds like either you were born like this, Chris, right? So you came straight out, I just get everybody, I'm going to be really empathetic and I make these connections. Or
as a toddler.
Oh.
Sorting out all the conflict in the playground, right? We're going to talk about this, we're going to sort of, or you've had your own kind of epiphanies along the way about these kind of things. So how has it been for you then? Have you always felt that kind of empathetic connection, or is this something that you've been on a journey through and found this your way through on that?
Oh, I love that question, Andrew. And there's two things that come to mind. One, I'm sort of channeling, you know, Mr. Rogers in this respect, that, you know, if you sort of put someone up on that pedestal of, well, it looks like it comes easily for you, so therefore I could never get there, that sort of undermines your own capacity for improvement, and also probably trivializes the amount of work that person put in to make it look somewhat effortless, because it does take hours and hours and hours of practice and conscious intention and thought to get to that point where word choices and, you know, vocal inflection and awareness of body language all starts to kind of gel intuitively. And, you know, I think the first insight for me that I can recall, at least, other than sort of a curiosity of, like, wait, I'm not sure that I know how to do this, was back, gosh, this would have been in my early residency days, so 04 to 05. I had the opportunity to work with a veterinary social worker by the name of Janine Moga, who is still active in the US. She's more on the East Coast now. But brilliant woman who was really, in my mind, responsible for probably changing or influencing the way in which I practice as much or more than my clinical instructors did. And what she really opened my eyes to, both in terms of being sort of a collaborative partner with cases that I was working on, you know, by way of let's say I was working with a case and feeling like I had the solution, whatever that was, and I was experiencing some degree of roadblock or resistance, or it wasn't working, I was concerned about implementation, something about the human element was just not working. And so I was starting to feel like I was spinning my wheels, meaning I don't have more solutions. I think the problem needs to be something else. So I would go to her and she would simply say, well, just walk me through the case. And inevitably within that conversation, she would go, oh, okay. And of course, at that point, I was completely and totally clueless as to what insights she was pulling together. But then we would walk through it and she would say, okay, so, you know, I think we'll have to go back and confirm whether this is the case, but it sounds like, you know, the resistance you're experiencing here, you know, combined with this element and this element and this element, may allow us to understand that this is a client, for example, you're asking them to take a very, let's say, operant directive role with their animal, and yet every other life experience that this person has shared is them shying away from leadership and responsibility. You're asking them to do the very thing they're running away from in every other aspect of their life. It's no wonder that you're struggling as a clinician to try to get them to onboard this particular action. And so I've got just a couple of, you know, pivotal cases from early on where I was like, whoa, I don't have a clue what I'm doing. I don't know. And yet when we were able to do that while still staying in my lane of being a veterinarian, a veterinary behavior resident, and eventually a clinical specialist, without going outside of my lane and dabbling in human psychology, I can at the very least sort of acknowledge that it exists, tag out and tag some other people in to be able to assist. And I've learned over the years sort of how to do that more and more effectively. But honestly, it's that veterinary social work field that has informed that aspect of my practice probably more than any other.
So what is veterinary social work, Chris? We don't have that in the UK.
You need to get it because it's amazing. Yeah, so I remember the very same. So and again, this is going back 04, 05. So this is, you know, this is 17 years ago. I think it was sort of more in its infancy then, but it has been around since then. And so it's individuals with a social work degree of some, you know, some background. So they're understanding that, well, all of the things that social workers are taught in terms of systems and support and relationships and, you know, mental health and all of these things, and applying that to the veterinary space. And so, do they have
a veterinary degree as well, or are they a paraprofessional?
More, it's a paraprofessional role. Okay. Yeah. And so,
with the practice, like, are they employed as a consultant or in a permanent role, or either or? Yeah. So it's
definitely
like we need it over here.
It's amazing. And I remember back at the university where I was first practicing, Janine, in that initial capacity. So we used her a lot in behavioral services. And then the two other disciplines, at least there, where she got a lot of case volume, shall we say, would have been in oncology or in emergency critical care, where she wasn't there to counsel people through the therapeutic decisions. She was there to help people make decisions about the options that were put in front of them by the clinician. Yeah. So, you know, if you have questions about cardiac health, awesome, you need to talk to your doctor. If you're stuck within the process of making a decision or not sure how to move forward, wrestling with the emotional weight of one decision versus another, she might be able to step in and help that individual sort of process through that to gain clarity as to which option, it wasn't necessarily right or wrong, but made the most sense for them in the system they were working in. And then she could tag back off to the clinician. They could go back in and, well, continue doing what they do as a clinician. And it just opened my eyes to all of those additional layers that exist for the vast majority of our clients.
Yeah.
that we're completely oblivious to. And if we can have that conversation with a client, why can't we have it with the dog?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Just have to just say, like, that sums up everything, bringing it full circle to like what we're trying to do here, and everything that's lit a match under our asses to have this conversation, frankly, right? Is that like it all matters, you know? The whole reason I kind of put legs out there is it's like we're forgetting all these pieces. Like the environment could be pulling the rug out from under that dog every day, and the owner, you know? And if we can't like account for that, then what doesn't matter what we do over here with the learning, you know? And we all kind of bring our own things to the table. Maybe you brought your amazing clairvoyance from the time you were a toddler. That was just who you were, you know? And then so we have to meet Chris there, because that's who you are. And every dog, every person, there's more than even just an immediate backstory. There's that kind of like family history backstory, any selective forces, especially in the case of dogs and dog breeds and whatnot. But for any one of us, like there are so many things that have molded us in critical ways throughout our life that go so much further back in that big old fat antecedent and all the things that go into it that we're not really taught to look at. And you were saying so well a moment ago about how we start with that how. So we start by, okay, how do we change the behavior? And immediately the pressure's on all of us then, isn't it? The professional's like, shit, I got to figure out how to change the behavior. The owner's like, crap, I got to figure out how to follow all their directions and make sure I'm doing it right. And the dog's like, more pressure, where they're trying to make me do things that I don't understand. And it can all feel suddenly very arbitrary to what's really going on at the center of it. And oftentimes, if you just flip it around and you say, but why? Like with Kathy, with your concept of being a detective, to have that fundamental scientific heart of curiosity, it's like, wonder what that's all about, you know? And then really digging and not being apologetic for the process of digging and realizing that's where we will get to those moments with the clients. And it's literally still my favorite moment ever with every client when that happens, where they go, oh my gosh, it finally makes sense. You know, like this, they've gone to 6 trainers who've told them nothing that helps them understand what's going on. Tons of random instructions that they're like, are you sure that's what I should do? That doesn't feel right, but okay, I'll do it. You know, and then the dog and that person having gone through all that frustration and the confusion through those cycles of that only operant. It's not that operant isn't valid. It's just that kind of tool we pick up at the end when we say, I feel more confident about the how now. But really that like that human part of the relief, Andrew, too, of like, it's okay that we're here. And I can have compassion for my dog. I can have compassion for myself. I don't have to impress everyone. I don't have to have like this perfectly obedient little minion, you know, and I can still be the perfect family for this dog by meeting them where they are. And I think our job is to help both of them meet each other by us meeting them first, right?
I mean, we became, somewhere along the way, we became obsessed with the idea that the dog has to learn something. And I think that's, as a principle, fundamentally flawed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know, Chris, how you feel when you go into your cases, but I think, you know, teaching the dog something is kind of the last thing on your mind, isn't it? It's about learning from the dog and trying to understand the situation.
Yeah, yes. And, you know, the thought that comes to mind there too is, especially if I've got a client who is coming in with an expectation of fixing, that implies action. It doesn't involve a lot of questions. You know, if we ask a lot of questions and don't really come up with answers, unless I've onboarded that client to that process already, I'm going to send a very dissatisfied client out the door, and I may then not get the opportunity to move forward. So part of that sort of consulting practice for me is can we sort of massage our way into something that allows for that curiosity to start happening? And that might even be by, you know, sometimes I'll tell the client, you know, as I'm getting a little bit of feedback and watching the animal move around, I say, you know what, I'm going to teach him something, not because this skill is the most important thing in the world. It might be a little hand target or a watch me, or literally it could be just an arbitrary skill, but I want to see how your dog processes the information in its surroundings. And so don't worry so much about the mechanics of this or whether we get it right. I just want to see what this dialogue looks like for your animal. So by trying to model some of that curiosity and hopefully creating a little moment through a teaching example where the client goes, gosh, I didn't know my dog was capable of that in such a short period of time. Then I can have that question of, well, gosh, if we didn't know that, what are the other 900 things about your dog that we haven't even bothered to ask the question? And now we're creating more of a space of curiosity. And now I'm sort of looking side by side with my client, looking at that animal, creating that process. Cool. You know, and then I can set those expectations. Today, we're going to be able to get this far. We're not going to be done, whatever that even means. So the process is going to look like this. But for many of my clients, if I started out that way, without kind of getting them on board first, I might lose them before we ever got started.
Yeah.
That's a really good point about getting people invested in the process that you want to kind of map out. And I think we have to match them up their level of involvement, investment, and expectation right now. And I think that's, you know, when I go out with to meet a client in the environment, and their dog might have, say, dog issues, I know the client is waiting for us to make observations when that dog sees a dog. So I want to get some observations in before that to see how your dog did that, to see how your dog did that. And they're like, oh yeah, that's really cool. Didn't realize my dog did that. Didn't realize my dog. And then that, you know, like I say, that questioning starts to happen. So if we do see things in the environment, then we're starting to see it differently. So I think we can risk as trainers turning up and putting the spotlight on us, which is, let me show you what I can do with your dog, as part of that actual fixing process, if you like. But we've got to find these different ways of getting the spotlight on the dog and get the owners to kind of recognize the importance of getting that feedback from what their dog's trying to tell them. Mm-hmm. And just a bigger picture point here, I think the other issue on having a very operant approach, this is something else I talk about why we as humans are very judgmental of behavior anyway. We have to recognize that we are kind of predisposed to be judgmental of other people's behaviors. We see our own behavior differently, of course, but we kind of judge others in that way. And unless we allow an element of empathy or an element of being able to experience, oh, there's my dog, another person or another animal's and the species experience, we're going to get stuck in doing the same thing. And sadly, the operant side of things, so we go along, they do things. Hopefully my husband will go and deal with that in a second. We're kind of feeding back into that again. This is the point if we're not careful. So like we discussed last time, if we turn up, even using positive means of, yeah, we're going to change that behavior and here's how we do it, the client still is hearing behavior wrong, must change it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Chris.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kathy.
It's your time.
I'm going to mute myself a minute.
Oh my gosh. So one of the words that that I'm hearing that I keep coming back to, and Andrew, I think you had mentioned this before, and then I think Kim, you echoed it back, is that relief word. And something that comes to mind for me here is also sort of, where is that pressure, if you will, that weight, where does that go? And I think it's an important thing, especially, my perspective is first and foremost as a veterinarian, and within the veterinary profession as a whole, we're really struggling emotionally right now, especially with suicide, with a lot of emotional mental health crises. And it's obviously a very, very complex layer, but I think in some ways what we're talking about here touches on that if I go in as the veterinarian and I tell the client, I can fix your animal, or here is the next things forward, I've basically taken the weight off of you, and I've taken that on now as the fixer. And yet I don't have any more control over the outcome for that patient than anyone else did. And so in some ways, it's almost more about sort of, okay, can we take that pressure? Can we create a sense of relief? But not by anyone taking on that weight themselves, but by saying, we're feeling the weight of trying to control this outcome. Can we take that pressure, just pick it up for a second, and can we put it over here? We'll come back to it if we need to. We probably don't, FYI, but if we do, we can come back to it. But I don't need to hold on to that myself, nor do you need to hold that. And so I think that's sort of, again, as we move beyond the operant, which it's a brilliant phrase, by the way. I I love saying it, beyond the operant. As we keep moving beyond there, that's another piece too, that if we're stuck in this operant fix-it role, somebody has to keep carrying the weight for controlling all of those outcomes. And it's a weight that none of us really truthfully need to carry, number one, or that we're capable of carrying, number two.
God, Chris, you're so right about that. It's like a game of hot potato, right? Like we toss around the responsibility. Oh, now it's the dog's fault. Now it's the owner's fault. Now it's the vet's fault. Now it's the trainer's fault. Like, instead of, could we just back off the pressure of the expectations of everyone, right? Like, just that compassionate curiosity about what's going on and saying, here's what I think, here's what I have, here's what I propose that we do. And then letting that be a dynamic, organic process where, you know, and I do think that's something that needs to shift for whatever reason in the dog world. I think like the dog world is so predisposed to this because of this weird concept we have where dogs are like neither human nor animal in a way, like they're not quite of the natural world because they're kind of our little, I don't know, bridge. They're in a little vortex where they don't really fit neatly into the animal kingdom. We don't allow for that much flexibility and mystery, and neither are they human. And yet we've been told that the model is we are the master, which we still carry in our subconscious. We are supposed to orchestrate how they behave in this kind of tabula rasa sense. And then the owner feels like a failure when their dog doesn't reflect perfect work to create this perfect behavior. And if let's say the owner feels like, well, I did everything right, then it's either the trainer failed or the dog failed, or the veterinarian failed, right? So if it comes into something where we want some veterinary behavioral kind of input on something that's going on that's more complicated, it's like, well, you gave him the wrong drug or whatever, right? Like, instead of gosh, that's just such a beautiful and important thing to say, is that we need to all in the pet dog industry call out this like subconscious set of expectations as owners, as trainers, as vets, whatever, that we bring to the table and we project all over each other and the dog. It's just not helping.
I mean, the first expectation is that the dog should be any other way than the way the dog is right now. That's the very first expectation that, I mean, is there every time someone seeks help and advice. And it's fine. We just need to check and remember that is an expectation. We've created that expectation. It comes, you know, it's created by us. It isn't truth. It's not necessarily true that the dog needs to change anything.
So I think
sorry, Andrew, it's maybe a question for all of you because you're all kind of behaviour clinicians. But what percentage of your clients do you think come to you and actually think that there's something genuinely wrong with their dog in terms of pathology versus they're having difficulties providing what their dog needs to be able to live happily?
A lot.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to this notion of abstract normal, and this conversation we're having now, we could equally be having it about how, especially in Western cultures, how we think about and bring up children regarding expectations of norm, expectations of what success means, expectation of what results means. Especially going through here in the UK, we have a comprehensive education system, which is hugely flawed because of these problems, and we still haven't quite stepped back as a society yet from a human psychology point of view to recognize the lack of personal development freedoms that we are enforcing on young children, right? And it's something that Kathy and I are exploring a little bit at the talk we're doing for Victoria Stilwell's conference, because there are some connections here. We've kind of putting this and projecting this onto our dogs when we don't have to. We've kind of created a comprehensive educational system for our dogs when we totally don't need to. So we're just reliving the same mistakes. So a lot of this is because we're humans, right? Because we're just a little bit buggered, aren't we? But yeah. So I think, but it's interesting the kind of diversion there. But yeah, that's a really good point, Kathy. And I think most professionals listening will recognise that many clients about my dog can't possibly be normal, right? Because the dog down the road, it's that whole Lassie syndrome thing. The whole dog down the road doesn't do it, so it must be wrong with my dog. Therefore, like you said, Kim, then we start thinking, well, who's to blame then? So is it me and I'll torture myself, or is it the guy on the telly because I was following his advice, or is it my mother-in-law because she told me what to do, or is it the vet, or is it the trainer? And we just start going down this path.
Right. And what if the whole thing is just an enormous misunderstanding 99% of the time, which is kind of what I think, right? Like, I think
or a normal response to an abnormal environment.
Right, exactly. So it's like, I guess that was one of my interests in talking about pathologizing normal behavior today, is because I think we have this incredible lean towards it's wrong, it's broken, fix it, you know, treat it, solve it, thinking it's not normal, where we have this arbitrary concept of normal, where I would argue the vast majority of the behavior, both that humans and animals are reflecting, even if it's reflective of really poor mental or behavioral health, is a very normal response to the conditions that created it, whatever those are, internal, external, biological, whatever, learned. And so it's the being trying to kind of navigate, right, with all of those forces to try to be functional. I mean, nature has this bias towards solving problems, not creating more problems. And so it's not like the animal is just like intentionally being dysfunctional, you know, and then that idea that like, oh, this one's broken, this one's the pathological one. I think that that's rare. We see those dogs definitely where you're like, there's really something wrong, like processing not happening correctly, whatever it might be. You know, sometimes like things like you were saying, Chris, you know, compulsive behaviors and things like that might very much have like a genetic basis that is even abnormal for a group of dogs that are arguably all neurotic, like herding dogs or something like that. But you have this lack then of understanding of what's really going on. And right, that's the point that we're all trying to get at, is like, what if so much of what we're doing is starting from a point of misunderstanding? Like, isn't that just such a sad crime that none of us intend? If we're so focused on how to change things that we're missing it. Like, and like you said, then you're playing whack-a-mole. You solve this expression of this dysfunction only to find it pops out over here. And then you solve that expression of the dysfunction only to find it pops out over here. And, you know, as soon as I feel like someone brings me something and we've tried to just kind of address that, like it seemed like that was all that was probably going on. So we're like, okay, no other kind of indicators that there's something we're missing here. Let's proceed kind of addressing this context. And then that gets totally better. And then something completely new pops up. I'm like, all right, we got to do a whole nother deep dive, you know, to figure out we're missing something. And I think we're also kind of all like embarrassed, right? Because of the human ego thing. So we don't want to be like, oh, I was totally wrong. Round one, round two, start over. But we have to be able to do that, don't we?
Yeah. And that was something I love that you just said that, Kim, because, you know, when we were talking about the counseling strategies, that in and of itself is something that we can do with our clients. So let's say I'm working with that client who comes in with the fix it mentality, and I've given them a couple opportunities to be curious within an initial consult, and they are just not walking through that door that I left open for them. So that is not an inroad for today. Cool. Well, then we're going to start with 1 or 2 fix it strategies. And your animal's response to this will inform us as to whether or not this was an appropriate strategy. And what I need for you to understand, and I'll tell you 37 times if I need to, is that if this doesn't work, then that informs what we do next. It wasn't a failure. It wasn't like we put an X through that box. And that is data. That's information. And so the mindset, I think one of the words that came up in the first call that I loved hearing was barometer. Right, was that sort of mindset that so many of these patterns can actually function, not as something that needed to be fixed or resolved, but as an indicator of underlying need state. And so, you know, if the class says, well, gosh, but what do I do about this? I'm like, just watch it. Let's just see what happens with that while we focus on that underlying emotional or physiologic pattern that we think is our actual focus. But rather than trying to suppress or change that really readily observable, measurable thing, let's just track it and see what happens. Because, you know, for me, it gets us, you know, as we talk about these conversations that are occurring, it brings to mind one other concept, and that is, you know, the comment that I hear so often from, I would say, either lay people in general, whether they're pet owners or just random people in public, when we talk about being a veterinarian or a veterinary behaviorist. And they said, well, gosh, wouldn't it just be so much easier if the animal could tell you what was wrong? I'm like, well, they kind of do. right? Like, where is their attention? Where is their avoidance? What are the patterns that show up? Are we seeing sort of ratcheting down and sort of negative states? Are we seeing positive or outward affective? They're telling us so much, but it's oblivious to so many individuals because they haven't had the education to know that it's meaningful data.
Well, and I want to take a moment just to talk about, I promise I won't hog too much time, we'll just jump back out. But this idea that we have with like observational behavior, right? And we have this emphasis on operationalize things and observable behavior. Okay, we should be putting so much emphasis on observing behavior. But I think my whole kind of question is, and concern, if we're just observing and like counting those behaviors and we're just looking at what immediately is coming before it, even just the last few days, if we want to go back that far, but we're not really stepping back, then we might be taking good notes on counting observable behaviors, but we don't necessarily think that they're reflective of something deeper that is invisible. It's almost like we've been chastised for talking about that which is invisible. So Kathy, all of your work, right, talking about neuroscience and how much of that is completely invisible to us, it doesn't make it any less real.
No. And it doesn't mean that in, 20 years time, there won't be specific diagnoses, that you won't be able to have imaging modalities that can tell you exactly what the functionality of individual neurons are and how they're functionally and structurally connected. That's what we're all working towards. And I think, there are lots of breaks in technology recently that would suggest we're getting there pretty fast. I mean, certainly things like, free walking MRI scanners and stuff. We used to think those were the thing of sci-fi, and they're actually not that far away right now. So yeah, we may get to the point where we can make specific diagnoses, but one of the things that I've been kind of reflecting on over the last couple of weeks, I've gone into a bit of a dark rabbit warren of thought. And one of the things that I'm really interested now to continue and follow up is bringing together this conversation about what science is and how thinking about what it is influences how we apply it. And when you actually look at the history of science, you can see and you understand the process of science. So it's the generation of data, but then the interpretation of those data. And the way that we apply that is to take the interpretation and apply the interpretation. So we take the discussion part of the paper and we then apply what was discussed in the discussion part of the paper. But of course, already there you've got inaccuracy because the discussion is somebody's opinion on those data. And the kind of true purist scientist will go and look at the data. But of course, most of that isn't freely available because we don't have free publishing. That brings us on to another social justice issue, which I'll try and steer clear of. But, we don't have open access and we don't have the transparent publishing of raw data. But when you start going down this rabbit warren, you realise that there are some really important concepts like sexism within science. So fight and flight, we talk about as being true. We talk about the fact that that's been proven at lots of different levels. And it is true that when animals are stressed, they respond with fight or flight or freeze. But it's really interesting to look back at the history of those data and realise that they're only generated from male animals. When you look at the data that comes from female animals, all you see in the discussion is, well, this didn't really work very well because you can't really do this stuff with females. Well, females are 50% of the population. So maybe fight, flight and freeze is only a male thing. And actually there are some data now suggesting that females do respond very differently, and not just at the behavioural level, but also at the neuronal level, at the network level, at the hormonal level. This isn't that surprising when you look at why scientists don't include females in a lot of neuroscience. And there's a brilliant scientist I work with in Sinai who's made this her career by accident, just because she was fighting so hard to include 50% females in her studies and being told, no, we won't fund you because you'll just have too much noise in your data. And she was saying, well, yeah, I will, but that noise is the reality. That messy noise is the reality. We actually need to find out what that 50% of the population is telling us about those physiological processes. So I'm not saying that science is fundamentally flawed. I'm just saying really that it's fundamentally misunderstood, and that the idea that we weaponize evidence-based, stay in your lane, we must remain science-based. We just need to be a little bit careful about that and a little bit yeah, mindful of that, I think. And I don't know what your experience, Chris, is, because you sound like you're really bringing together lots of strings of thought processes that aren't just about what you're taught at vet school. They're very much about real life and the messiness of real life and how you embrace that and create something, you know, really worthwhile. So yeah, I'm not really quite sure where I was going with that, but it kind of just always brings me back to the idea that if we're always focusing on behaviour and we're always focusing on objective measures, we're always off base, because science is off base to start with. So
at the very least,
don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but just be mindful. Yeah, it's one part of the process. It's a really important part of the process, but it's one part of the process, and it can't be whole and complete because its very foundations aren't yet whole and complete.
I love that, and even just thinking about that as very one specific tangible piece. To me, it brings to mind all of the struggles that we find with behavioral research that actually occurs in real life scenarios. You know, and the classic example that comes up to me while we're talking about sort of hormonal influences and things like that is, you know, spay, neuter, yes, no, male, female, what are the influences, what are the effects on behavior? And, you know, so at one point I had a, 60 to 90 minute presentation that I attempted to pull together the literature as it stood at that point in time to say, what do we know? And basically I would start and end that presentation with a statement of, I'm going to share with you the data as we think we understand it. And what I want you to understand is if you have a strongly held opinion about this, you will find data points in what I'm about to share with you that agree with you. I really don't care what your opinion is. I will share data points that will agree with you. Yeah. The problem is that it's not at all conclusive, right? So there isn't an answer because there's so many layers to that conversation. And so your thought about sort of weaponizing that data point, that, well, the conclusion is this, and so therefore, it's like, well, okay, the conclusion based on this pocket of information appears to be this. And so now what do we need to know?
Yeah.
You know, like, okay, pour me a glass of, Cabernet or Pinot Noir, because we got some stuff to dig into here. Like, that's where I'm going with that versus we have the answer. And I think that's also a piece that, when we talk about sort of the accessibility of science and a lot of science being sort of presented to the layperson, and I don't mean that in any sort of a judgmental way, but someone who may not have a solid foundational education in the scientific process and the scientific method, is that it looks very finite, right? Well, the answer is this, and because our brains love concrete data points, it allows us to then sort of dig our heels in and sort of sit with that resolute idea, and then we fight it, and it becomes an emotionally held belief, and God forbid anybody challenges an emotionally held belief with more data. Unless you've got a practice of challenging your own belief systems on the regular, it's a really scary place to be, right? Like there's that predictability is so, oh gosh.
Scary or exciting.
Yeah.
Right, depending on your perspective and your level of curiosity, coming back to that. But yeah, just like that lack of understanding, people then start arguing different points versus, someone who has perhaps that more curious background in science to say, well, you may actually both be right, you may actually both be wrong.
Yeah.
I don't actually know, but then we're back to sitting with uncertainty, which is a very also scary place to be if you're not comfortable with that.
Yeah.
Gosh,
yeah.
so many layers.
Yeah, no, it's all interconnected, isn't it? That's what I've been grappling with for 2 weeks in my rabbit warren, is the interconnectivity of everything. And basically, I wish I was a philosopher, because I think that's where it's all at. I think, philosophy is where it's at.
Yeah, what was that quote I sent you from that movie Stray, Andrew?
Oh, yes.
It said, both of you in the stream. Have y'all all seen that new documentary Stray yet?
I haven't seen it yet, no.
Oh, it's remarkable. It's beautiful because it just honors the integrity of a dog living on the streets in Turkey, following him for the life that he's leading. And there's no script, there's no interpretation. It just follows the dog with this beautiful photography. And there's these little quotes put in there. And I sent one to Andrew because, he's half philosopher himself, but it said, and this is from something BC, right? I don't remember what it was, but it was like dogs and philosophers are the most important and least appreciated contributors to society or something like that, you know? But yeah, I think you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable, right? We have to get comfortable saying, going back to this first part of the conversation, I don't know, and that's okay. And the more I know, the more I realize how much I don't know, and that's still okay. And there's not like we're going to get to the place where in our educational journey or our career as an owner or whatever, we know all the things, we've read all the studies, we can check all the boxes, we've bought our ideology hook, line, and sinker, and we know we're correct. Well, to me, that's where hell starts, right? Like, so I want to back off of that narrative. I want to be able to say, like, we can always be wrong. We can always learn more. I welcome the opportunity for any situation to prove me wrong. And yet not to say that that means it's all ambiguous and there's no point in researching, right? Because I think that's the other place people go.
It's not binary. Yeah. It's not chaos or certainty. It's just a bit in the middle, the reality.
And that's why I think this kind of little project, if you like, if you want to call it a project, the Beyond the Operant project that we're kind of on, it is a philosophical endeavor. Because I think all of our individual disciplines can take us really close up, right? And philosophy is about stepping back. And that's what this whole discussion's about. And I think the collaborative nature of this discussion is what makes it really powerful. Because whilst we have different outlooks, different disciplines, different life experiences, there are some of these wonderful threads that are just with, hang on, these connect, this connects, this connects. And not only does it connect us, but it also starts to connect us to the animals that we care for and we're working with. And that's got to be the best place to start, really. Putting some of the human ego to one side and just looking for those threads that unite. And I think that's what Beyond the Operant's really doing with this narrative we're building on.
Love that. Yeah, I'm grateful. There was a conversation or a question that was asked earlier about sort of my educational journey, and part of that was my undergraduate degree was from a liberal arts college, a small liberal arts college in the Midwest in the US. And so you're required to take philosophy courses, you're required to take public speaking courses, and you're required to do all of these things for that well-rounded perspective. And to me, I'm so grateful for having had those opportunities. I don't know that I recognized it at the time, but having some of that exposure to religion and theology and philosophy and science and, learning how to be a high level musician and a vocalist and a performer and sort of understanding acoustics and stage presence and like all of these little elements that you sort of learn from different segments of your life start to come together, and these threads start to really connect. And it allows us to, as we're saying, sort of not only gain sort of certainty about, oh, these are the things that I know or think I know, but it also allows for the comfort in the unknown as well. That for every individual, even the four of us on this call today, but anybody who's listening and anybody out there in the world has a completely different set of experiences that is no more right or wrong than the voices that we're sharing here today. It's just different, and it adds to the conversation. And so where can we find those common threads, those similarities? And gosh, I'm going to get on my own sort of social platform here for a second, but that is, anytime we start to get into an us versus them mindset, the question, that I've been sort of learning, and I'm learning, this is new for me, and it's still really hard sometimes, is basically to say, as we talk about sort of, science bringing us close in, or our specialties bringing us close in, how far out do I need to pull before the umbrella sort of unites me with whoever that other individual is? Whether that umbrella is just because we're both human or we're both breathing, like if I need to pull that far out, that's fine. But at some point there has to be a level of us and that interconnectedness that allows us to have conversations that are not sort of on opposite sides of a chasm. And that's as true for behavioral work as it is for any other social, scientific conversation that exists. But it's super hard, especially when we feel strongly about things.
And wasn't that what inspired this whole thing, right? Like, what was it not this whole conversation that was going on social media about people beating each other up about the various sides of the fence from, you know, their operant merry-go-round kind of perspectives. And we all, of course, have our opinions and our beliefs about those things. But God, Chris, your point is so right. It's like, as soon as we're fixed, as soon as we're up in it and we think, I know all the things, whether I've read all the data points and I've decided that that's the evidence that I need to just commit myself to this, the kind of religion we make out of that makes us so immovable and also insensitive to other, that and you know, that phenomenon of us and them has just been one of the things that has been so well studied in human psychology and anthropology, is the cornerstone on which this kind of tribalism that it then excuses these behaviors that we would say we don't believe in, but you're not the same as me, so I can do this to you. And we do this to each other in the industry. We do this to dogs, right? Like, you're different when I want you to be different, and then you're the same when I want you to be the same. And you know, all that polarity, it doesn't serve truth. And we're sure as heck not serving ourselves or each other. Like, it just keeps us stuck. And yet that discomfort with being uncomfortable, it's a big ask, right? Because we are human, and because our brains do want that predictability and the sense of, okay, resolute, yes, check the box, moving on. It's very hard to leave things feeling ambiguous. It really does create a little bit of fundamental anxiety. And in a way, that's kind of what we're asking our fellow practitioners to do here, is to pull back, stretch, be willing to say you don't know, and really just look at the largeness of it all, and always pull in more. Stay curious, because I guess what I find from my own experience is that the more I allow myself to do it, it's nerve-wracking, but that little thing is there when I need it, right? Have you had that experience in medicine and in behavior when, like, instead of going in like, what are the things I need to know about this type of resource guarding or separation anxiety case, I have to like review it in my head. You trust that it's in there. You know, I've been open, and I've let all those little dots connect in my own brain, such that when I walk in, I'm going to trust that it's just going to show itself, all those little connections of all the things. But sometimes it means really getting far away from the prescriptive model and the data points that we've kind of hung our hat on.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, what I was going to interrupt you rudely to say was, I think, again, it comes back to, it's not binary. People have it that you're either very strongly trying to change the other, or you may as well just give up. And actually, you know, there's a huge grey area in the middle, which is uncomfortable, and it isn't certainty, because it doesn't give you the certainty that you're either fighting the fight or you're nothing to do with the fight, but you're actually sitting there and willing to engage in it, even though you're acknowledging that you don't have all the answers. And
every relationship ever, right?
Yeah, no, every relationship ever. Yeah. And I think that's the difficulty that people have with the operant merry-go-round is, well, if I'm not fighting for, you know, positive reward, then what do I stand for? Maybe I stand for something that's bad. And, you know, there are lots of layers to that. We've talked about how people are overlaying meaning and emotion to the quadrants that isn't there. But ultimately, I think people very much feel passionate about standing for what they're standing for. I would argue using a flawed model. So actually, I would argue what most of them are standing for when I speak to them in detail is kindness, kindness, empathy, compassion. But it's got confused into this. If I fit into that part of the quadrant, then that labels me so that I'm visible for all to see as somebody who stands for those, what am I trying to say? Characteristics.
But that's the big irony for me, is our amazing colleagues who see themselves as being the kind of champions for that quadrant. And like I say, it's because they are caring and kind and empathetic. But actually, by championing that quadrant, they are on the opera merry-go-round, and the narrative will never move forwards. It'll just go round and round. And actually exploring and educating about the emotional experience is the way to move that narrative forwards. But, and this is probably a good way from my point to kind of end on tonight, I'm really interested in the human psychology element of this, because it's wrapped up in everything, because we're the primary carers, right? If we're inviting people to step into the emotional experience of others, we're definitely inviting them to step into their own emotional experience. And this is where it's better to kind of, we find it easier to project outwards and to fix and to change and to moderate. because if we're doing anything different, it puts a reflection on ourselves. So actually this conversation is quite radical in many ways, because we're unpicking so many aspects of what has guided us through our professions, different type of professions, regarding looking at the animal. But it's just as much about how we perceive ourselves and the societal changes that need to happen. It's quite overwhelming when you start thinking about it, because not only is it everything, but a lot of the things that we've taken as kind of a given regarding how we train and support dogs is kind of back to front. But then we start thinking about a lot of the stuff that we do for ourselves, right? So it just becomes this big topic. And a friend of Kathy and I's, Rachel, she's just amazing the way she sees life. But she's had a very different approach with her young son from day one. So he's never gone through a structured education system. He's been homeschooled. He's gone through things like the forest school system. Her interactions with him is very much based around his emotional need and his abilities to feel free to communicate emotional need, even through behaviors that society might find difficult, right? And it's just really refreshing to follow a story like that. So I know this is a bigger picture for tonight. I know, and I'm probably just going out there a bit and starting to waffle a bit, which I tend to do. But the point is, we have to dig deep on this stuff, because it's not just about thinking about how do I change how I train. It's a case of how do I change how I think, how do I change how I feel, and how do I change how I connect. There was a great thing I saw on social media the other day with somebody saying about somebody who's a Trump supporter, sorry to bring Trump in, and they were saying, oh yeah, he's so hateful. And they said, how do you feel about him? I hate him. So he was sharing hate with somebody who was sharing hate, right? And so it's just stepping back from that kind of
you know, I watched a mother this morning. I was dropping my car off to get fixed. She had a little toddler on her lap, probably 2 years old. And the little girl kicked her with her shoe. And she smacked the kid with her hand. And I thought, there it is, right there. Don't you kick me, you know? And it's, I mean, that's kind of what you're talking about in a way, right? Is like, we're saying you're so unkind to dogs that I'm going to be so unkind to you. And like, where does that leave any of us, right? No closer to understanding, especially when, honestly, when I've heard aversive trainers talk, as hard as it is for me to understand personally, I don't understand why I would pick up a shock collar to train, but I've also never tried. Now, I don't see the reason to, because I feel very comfortable with the way that I approach it. But frankly, most of those people will say, I do it because I love the dog. Now, I mean, they're not like people that are going around shocking dogs for fun, trying to hurt them, right? And like, so we have a misunderstanding that's happening there that's quite like religion or politics or any kind of other societal divide where you have these polar sides. And we're always assuming that the other is like the enemy, or they're crazy, or they have it wrong.
Different.
Yeah, they're other. It's that same us and them thing. And so I think, you know, for the humanistic value of our little project here, Andrew, we really are doing something more than talking about dog behavior. We're really asking that we all try to grow up together a little bit and evolve.
I think what Chris was saying earlier about how important it is, probably the most important, the two most important things from a professional point of view that we have to think about if we're going to start developing our industry to truly move forwards, is one, really getting good education about doing good observations. So observations without judgment or label, and that's hard, right? But you know, we have to learn more of that, but also how we communicate this, because ultimately, when we think about the concept of relief, an element of that is the ability to be able to communicate emotional need. We have to learn better about how our dogs are trying to communicate emotional need, but we also have to, you know, when I was working with humans, people often said it must have been easy working with humans, right? Because you can sit and talk to them. It kind of wasn't. It comes back to what you were saying earlier, Chris. The dogs are really good at communicating emotional need. Humans are really naff at it. So you have to kind of, as a therapist, listen to the words and pick out the bits and almost provide a mirror back to the person. Is this kind of what you mean then? Are we getting back to this? So actually, if we're going to start thinking about stepping into the animal's experience and making that a core element of what we do, we have to learn better about how to communicate emotional need, both for ourselves and to communicate it to others. So these are the things that we need to put a spotlight on. I think for some of our future discussions, I think getting people whose specialities are in kind of communicating emotional need would be great, because, you know, we can all learn from that.
I want a veterinary social worker on.
I just love the term social work anyway. Maybe we need behavioral social work, and maybe we just need that element, because it really, I think it's so obvious when you think about it, isn't it?
Mm.
I think
there's a little humility to that model, isn't there? Just a little more like, where are you at and what do you need and how can I help? And instead of this, I am the person with all of the power and the answers and the magic wand and, you know, this kind of bigger than life TV personality dog whisperer phenomenon that we, you know, have all gotten ourselves into. But just that humility of, what do you need? How can I help? What's happening? You know?
Yeah, there's so many layers, and I love the ability to explore that as people, you know, and so many of these concepts, you know, I'm floored to be a part of this conversation and to see where it goes and where the project goes. And I would also be remiss if I didn't, you know, at least put a little side mention in for one of the projects that I've been involved with over the last probably 6 months or so as well, which is the project we have affectionately referred to as the Lima Beings project.
Oh, I heard about that. Yeah.
So the sort of the impetus behind it was a conversation that started early in pandemic, where we were just almost commiserating about sort of the difficulties of life, which evolved into a little bit more of an introspective look as to what do we already know as animal behavior professionals, coming at it from a variety of angles, and what can we already, basically, what can we access that we already know how to do, which again, we could sort of raise all the questions about, do we actually know what we're doing or not? But can we start to apply that to the human-to-human conversations as well, with an awareness of behaviors and consequences and antecedents and needs and the ability to verbalize that? And so it's turned into this just a phenomenal project in its own right as well. That's gaining some momentum around that. And it's, you know, I think in many ways what's being focused on here and there are also really highlighting some really, really cool developments within our collective industries about this sort of moving beyond the operant. How do we advance our collective skills to do better, not by way of sort of better or worse, but to maintain that curiosity and continue to dig and explore those additional layers and see where that takes us. And it's just an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, it's a journey that's kind of beginning for all of us, right? It feels like 2020 is the year where everything got disrupted and thrown up in the air, and all the things that we were all just kind of going through the motions doing got blown up. And in a way, that's a really humbling place and hard place to be, but it's also a really beautiful, raw place to be, kind of that lotus moment, right? Like out of the mud, what's going to happen next? And already in our industry, it seems like it's magic, frankly. There's really exciting stuff happening. So I'm so grateful to all of you that you're willing to have this conversation with me, and so grateful to everyone who's listening, because they're part of this conversation, even if they're not sitting here, you know, on this platform of Zoom with us today. And they're all continuing to put in their 2 cents and comments and questions and concerns and ideas. And we're just so grateful to the whole industry, to all of y'all that have reached out to every one of us for years now, and very much so in the last few months, about how excited you are as well. So thanks again, Chris, for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks you for having me. This has been an absolute delight to be a part of. So onward and upward, right?
Yes, exactly. And of course, Andrew and Kathy, thanks again.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, good fun.
Thanks,
good fun
Kim.
had by all. Can't wait till it's in a bar, but until then.
Yeah.
Soon.
And please note, I'm the only one drinking. I'm very disappointed in you all.
It's still early here, you know, and I still have therapy with my father in 30 minutes. And so the human end of my work is not done yet.
Yeah, stay present, stay present.
Exactly. And humble and all of those things. Yeah.
I've just watched the air hostess, the air hostess, the TV show on HBO.
I haven't seen it.
It's about a very dysfunctional level of alcoholism in a very funny way that I didn't think the Americans could do. But interestingly, I think it did have British writers.
If it's funny, it probably did, frankly. But all right, you guys, take care. Till next time.
Take care.
Right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.